Could everyone please sit down? Thank you, Pam. We're all going to sit down now, right? How was lunch? All right, I got a thumbs up from Jim Miller. Do I get 2 thumbs up from anybody else? No, that was it? 1 thumbs up? Okay. How was dessert? Brownies looked kind of heavy. Were they good? You're a brownie guy? Okay. URI brownies. That's the way to go. All right, I'm going to hand this over to Teresa now.
Great, thanks Jen, and welcome everybody back from lunch. My name is Teresa Crean. I am a Coastal Research Associate here at the Coastal Resources Center and an Extension Specialist with the Rhode Island Sea Grant. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel, whose bios are all in the program materials, but I just wanted to share that we are going to be addressing the tribal story, and we have Bettina Washington, who's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer from Wampanoag Tribe of Gayhead. We also have from URI, Dr. John King, here at the Graduate School of Oceanography, and David Robinson, a marine archaeologist here at the GSO. So we're going to start this panel by asking Bettina to make some opening remarks, and then we'll move on to John and David, and then we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So with that, I will turn it over to our panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
A little closer, yeah.
Good afternoon. Is that better? My name is Bettina Washington. I am the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Cultural Director for the Wampanoag Tribe of Gayhead Aquina. We're located on Martha's Vineyard. I want to thank everyone for attending this afternoon, for welcoming me here to speak about this important issue. It is very important when we enter into any kind of project, but particularly ocean projects, for our tribe, for people to understand our oral history. Because that is how we came to live on what you all know as Martha's Vineyard, what we call Nope. We have been told that the continental shelf that is now underwater was dry land, and our people lived there. That's our oral history. But what does science say? During the Cape Wind Project, our oral history is what we repeated time and time again. And there was some evidence of that forest we talked about walking through. But at one point during that process, there were actually trees appearing on the beach. And we said, we told you so. It was in our stories, which we call history. It is so important for us that we find a way to work on a science, with scientists, with archaeologists, so that we can merge these two. It is not always a way for us to be in agreement, but a way for us to respect one another. I'll give an example in Turner's Falls, ancient lake. And our story says that the giant beaver ate all the fish out of that lake. The scientist says the lake was too cold for the fish to survive. So he and I are going back and forth. Nope, the beaver ate them. too cold, blah, blah. And I said, hold on. What's the bottom line? There's no fish in the lake. We don't need necessarily to agree why, but we both agree on the final statement. I'm very pleased that since the beginning of Cape Wind, we're talking almost a decade ago, that there have been strides made when projects come along, that they are looking at geotech, they are looking at geophysical. Because we know somewhere out on that ocean floor is evidence of our ancient villages. And it's important we find those before the drilling, the dredging, whatever needs to take place happens. Because once those things take place, the evidence is gone and it cannot be recaptured. And we all know how rare some of the paleo sites, even on land. So the ocean is so vast. We have a real challenge ahead of us. And it's going to, I believe, take everybody, and when I say everybody, tribal people, our elders, reaching out to all our tribal resources, archaeologists, and these are specialized fields. There's not a lot of people who do this type of work. So that gives us all another challenge on how we do train people to do this work. When you think about how big the ocean is, it would have been nice had, when they did the map, that we had started then to start looking, because we would be so far ahead and we would be prepared. I would say maybe perhaps one thing is that we aren't prepared enough. And in turn, that makes it look like we are causing projects to slow down. We're not. That is never our intent. That is not the tribal intent, to slow a project down. Our intent is to ensure our cultural concerns are looked after, and that we can look after them. We are responsible for our cultural concerns and the protection of our ancestors and our ancestral lands. Let's go next.
Is the microphone okay? Everybody hear me? Okay. So Bettina mentioned that we're getting ready. We're trying to get ready to be better able to identify her ancient ancestral sites in the offshore environment as part of the permitting that's done and the research that's done for offshore development projects. And what I'm going to talk to you about for a few minutes before we go back to the panel is a project that John and I have been working on for the last 4.5, 5 years now, that we've done with funding from BOEM and working in conjunction with the Narragansett Tribal Historic Preservation Office. Before I get started, though, I recently gave a talk in Australia, and one of the things that's a standard operating procedure there is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country, to acknowledge the indigenous people of Australia. So I'd like to do the same thing here as a standard operating procedure for the talks I give, and I'm going to read this to you because I think it's important. We acknowledge that this land we meet on here today is the traditional land of the Narragansett people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with this land. We also acknowledge the Narragansett people as the traditional custodians of this land, and that their traditional cultural beliefs and practices are still important to the living Narragansett people today. We also pay respects to the cultural authority of the Wampanoag Tribe of Gayhead Aquina and their Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Bettina Washington, who is participating with us in this session today, and of other Native peoples throughout southern New England and elsewhere who are here with us today, either in person or remotely. And the spirit behind me doing this is a spirit of respect, and it's a spirit of respect that I think is required for any project or any research that's done that involves looking at ancient native sites in an offshore or terrestrial environment. So to give you a sense of how this project started, it really came from comments that were made at a series of meetings, workshops as part of the ocean SAMP process, as part of some of the offshore wind farm development projects, and also because of some workshops that were done by BOEM over the course of the years relating to offshore alternative energy. And the question was a simple one that was raised by Doug Harris, our co-project principal investigator, and Bettina as well. And that question was, what standardized protocols are there for identifying our ancient tribal sites in an offshore environment? And when you think about the massive amount of potential impact that could take place to the continental shelf as a result of offshore alternative energy development, it's an extremely important question. As Bettina noted, we know that there were sites that were out on the continental shelf, ancient sites. We're beginning to find them. We've always known that they were there based on serendipitous finds by fishermen. But there's significant impacts that are going to happen to this old paleo landscape that was once occupied by ancient people. And we need to be better able, and BOEM recognized this, we need to be better able at identifying those ancient sites and protecting them. So because of the questions that Doug had posed, and he went to the Rhode Island Coastal Resource Management Council and Grover Fugate and posed the question to him, and Grover then posed the question to BOEM. And BOEM requested that we put together a proposal, which we did, and we received funding to do a 4-year study. And the participants in that study included scientists from BOEM, included Grover from CRMC, our folks in our lab at GSO, and scientists from NIFPO. The areas that we looked at are in this map that you can see here, but basically they covered the Kettle Pond, a couple of kettle ponds in the state, but primarily Gorton Pond up in Warwick, as well as some of the coastal and offshore waters off the coast of Rhode Island, within Narragansett Bay and Greenwich Bay, off the coast of Block Island, out in an area called the Mud Hole, an old deep area, and then in the area of mutual interest between Massachusetts and Rhode Island. The purpose of our study was to develop recommendations for a scientifically based, tribally sensitive, best practice methodology for identifying and protecting submerged sites. The anticipated outcome from this study was that the results of our research would then be given to BOEM and distributed actually to other federal and state agencies, and would be used to develop protocols in consultation with tribes and with developers and with other agencies, and then perhaps revisions to the current guidelines that BOEM has. The project deliverables included a workshop from the initial workshop that we did to bring everybody from the scientific community, the tribal community, and the state and federal agencies to talk about what our research plan was and to get their feedback before we had started to implement it. And then we produced a workshop report that's available online on the BOEM website. We also did a literature search and looked at existing geospatial data and pulled that all together into a GIS database. We produced a best practices document, which is now in draft form and is out for comment. If any of you would like a copy of that to give us your feedback, please let me know. We're also producing a series of field reports describing the studies that we did, a modeling report explaining where we see modeling needing to go in the future, and then a project executive summary and a final project report, a journal article, and a project film. One of the absolutely essential and unique aspects of this project was tribal integration and engagement in every aspect of the project, everything from research design to implementation of fieldwork and analysis of the data. And so part of that involved training tribal people in remote sensing technologies, as well as in scientific diving and in geotechnical and archaeological sampling. And here you see this series of pictures of the students that we had. Several of these students from NITHPO ended up becoming URI students and working with us in the lab on the project for the duration of the project. In terms of our key findings, in Gorton Pond, we were able to document the paleo-environmental record to create a framework for the rest of the study work that we did, an environmental framework dating back to about 12,500 years ago. In Greenwich Bay, we identified and documented the paleo landforms within the sediments of the bay that are now buried and submerged. There's an old river drainage that was there that we're able to map, and as part of that mapping exercise, we're able to identify a floodplain and see its different stages in doing analysis of the sediments as it transitioned from land to freshwater swamp, freshwater marsh, and then eventually an estuary environment and then a bay. And within those sediments, we found preserved several pieces of evidence of cultural activity there, consisting of stone chipping debris. This, in combination with hundreds of artifacts that had been found in the swash zone along the beach, which is why one of the reasons why we targeted this area to do our research, allowed us to document over 9,000 years of human history at Cedar Tree Beach. On Block Island, in that study area, we documented at West Beach a rather unique paleo environment that included trees in their original growth positions as well as root mat, and several cultural features, one of which was appears to be a hearth feature, and several areas of stone chipping debris, all in situ, all within the preserved paleosols. And then at the mud hole, we found evidence of a sandy beach deposit and cores that we took that indicates that there is a preserved terrestrial shoreline there that's associated with that large offshore deep water feature that would have presumably transitioned from being a pond or an old river channel into an estuary and then a bay and then completely submerged. And then in the AMI, looking at existing data, we didn't do any survey work there, but we looked at the existing data that was available and tested our hypothesis that we had originally had that the flat featureless areas of the seafloor might have less likelihood of having preserved paleo landscapes in them, but we found that to not be true. Flat featureless seafloor is not an indicator of potential preservation of important paleo landscapes that are buried. And then in terms of the best practices document recommendations, the best practice document is essentially divided into two parts. And I see that I'm running out of time, but
He can have some of my time.
I'm combining, John and I, our talks somewhat combined, so, yeah. So in terms of our best practices, really we divided the document into two sections. One was the agency tribal researcher engagement section, and then the other pertained to doing the actual geoarchaeological research. And the first section, what we concluded, and I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of time to talk. The document's much thicker than what you'd get from looking at a single slide, but these are kind of the key points. And the key points for the tribal engagement piece is that we need to improve the ability for agencies, tribes, and researchers to work better together through three basic key areas of improvement. That's improved communications, improved relationships, building relationships with one another, caring, trusting, respectful relationships, and then also building capacity for the tribes to better understand the Western science that John and I do, but also developing the capacity of the agencies and presumably researchers and developers in better understanding where tribes are coming from and what's important to them, and ways that we can go about doing the research that's required in a way that's respectful to those concerns that they have, which are, you know, important and real, and we need to pay attention to them. So as far as the geoarchaeological research is concerned, what we concluded was that predictive models, because we don't have the level of, well, we know of very few sites that exist offshore. We know they're there, but in terms of having a robust database that we can begin to develop archaeological site location models from for the offshore environment, it doesn't exist. And so for us to assume that we can go ahead with any kind of predictive modeling as to where sites might be as a management strategy, it's premature. It's too early to do that. We still need to collect site information data. We need to identify sites. We really need to build that database before we can begin to use predictive models for management. The other aspect is that the identification surveys that we do, rather than be site-focused, archaeological site-focused, they should be more paleo-environmentally focused. They should look to try to identify preserved, intact elements of the submerged paleo landscape that might contain sites. And it's much easier to try to identify those sites than it is to identify discrete archaeological sites. And so if we can find, essentially narrow the haystack in which we're looking for the needle, we can be much more efficient about the identification process for finding sites. And then the other aspect is that paleo landscape identification it requires a multidisciplinary process. John's a geologist, I'm an archaeologist. We need tribal people to be involved in this too, because they bring a wealth of knowledge that's different from archaeological knowledge and different from geological knowledge, but related. And we need to pull all that information together in a multidisciplinary process that needs to follow a standardized, systematic, phased investigative approach. It's not, we can't just go out and try to identify things that have been reported and call that science necessarily. We need to approach this in a phased approach. And that fits pretty well with the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 compliance that's required for permitting projects offshore. The parts of that process that have to be there, of course, first and foremost, tribal engagement. And that means not only consultation, but also engagement, involvement in the project. We need to do thorough desktop research before we go out and do the surveys. We really have to know the area that we're looking at, both geologically and from a cultural history standpoint, before we go out to do the survey work. And then the survey that we do, there's often a, I guess a tendency to utilize survey techniques that are become standardized in cultural resource management survey. For doing this type of work, we can't take that approach. We have to be thinking outside the box, and we have to be applying the technologies and the techniques that are particular to the local area that you're surveying, or the region that you're surveying in, because the geomorphology, depending on whether you're in the Gulf of Maine or whether you're south of Cape Cod or in Nantucket Sound or off of Long Island, they're very different. And so one technology that works really well in one area, it might not work as well in another area. So you really have to design these surveys and utilize the equipment that is specific to the environment that you're working within. And then in terms of next steps, and John's going to talk about this in greater detail, really what we're looking at is trying to build capacity. It's not enough just to create opportunities for tribes to be involved. We have to develop the capacity for them to be involved. And John, if you want to follow up with that.
I'd like to riff off a little bit of what we've been hearing over the last 1.5 days with respect to stakeholder groups. You know, we've been hearing quite a lot about the fishing community as a stakeholder group and what would constitute best practices with respect to that community. The tribes are another equally important stakeholder group, and there are some similarities in the approach that I think needs to be taken. Now, capacity building, it sort of starts with building partnerships and building trust, and that's the same thing that we've heard with respect to the fishing community. How to go about building that capacity, I think the fishing community has rightfully described what might happen when you have several of these projects moving forward simultaneously, and I'll label it the way I thought I heard it described. It was death by 1,000 meetings. They don't have the capacity to go to all those meetings. Well, the same thing is true of tribes. They have historic preservation offices that there's a lot of variation among tribes, but I don't think any of the historic preservation offices that I've encountered are overstaffed. And, the difference between maybe the tribal situation and the fishing community situation is that there are federal statutes that dictate how interactions are supposed to happen between our federal government and their federal governments, because they're sovereign nations. And the legislation is in place in law, but there's also a couple of executive orders, one from the Clinton administration and one from the Obama administration, which actually say explicitly that federal agencies have to build capacity within tribes in order to be able to respond meaningfully to all these projects that are ramping up. And that not only includes offshore alternative energy, we have oil and gas starting to ramp up on our coast again. So it's right in there that that's supposed to happen. The other observation I would make is that BOEM has probably the best group of archaeologists of all the federal agencies that I've encountered, and they don't actually have enough staff or even close to it to respond to all these projects. So the capacity building sort of spans internal to the federal agencies. It goes into the tribal historic preservation offices, and it also extends to academia. We play a pretty important role in this, and one of the things that we did in this project that was significant is that we engaged in training and capacity building exercises on large research vessels. The training and capacity building sort of cut both ways because, unlike a meeting on land, which is maybe a consultation process, a lot of those meetings, they can be pretty contentious, and people can vent at those meetings, but they can always escape from each other at the end of the meeting, and the meetings don't usually last that long. When you're out there on a research vessel, there's no escape. So you actually have to talk to each other and communicate rather than talk at each other. So that kind of capacity building is extremely effective. Some of the, I would characterize as breakthroughs in our project occurred on these research vessels. The other thing that I would say is that the training cuts both ways. We're training tribal people in Western scientific methods, but tribal people are some of the best natural scientists around, and they see things and sense things on a landscape that we don't. And I've always valued remote sensing techniques that worked. And I don't have to know how it works, but if it produces a result, fine by me. And we've seen some of that on this project, where tribal people will actually point at a spot, or as we're passing by a spot, they'll say, something important is here. And we've found evidence that that's likely true. I don't have to know how it works. If it works, I'm going to use it. And these projects benefit both communities, and I've learned a lot. Most people know 5 years ago, I was probably one of the least patient people on the planet. I'm not going to say that I'm one of the more patient, because I'm still not, but I'm at least maybe at the median now. And a lot of that has come from altering my sense of time as a linear thing and interpreting it more as a circular thing, as tribal people do. So I just like to make the point that as we're considering best practices for, say, the fishing community, which is obvious and a no-brainer, a lot of the same things pertain to tribes, and they actually have stronger statutes on their side than the fishing community does. So I'll end at that point.
Thank you, John. Bettina, would you like to make any follow-up comments or reactions to the presentations after yours?
Well, it's nice to know that we have folks on our side. I've actually known Mr. Robinson how long? And he's always been interested in hearing the tribal side of the story, and that sensitivity and the willingness to learn is very important, because it has to do with respect, and not so much my generation. I would say we're still working through that, but definitely we've heard from our grandparents and our parents that they weren't always respected for the knowledge they knew, and I think of how much has been set aside. I'm not going to say the knowledge has been lost, but it's been set aside for these years when it could have been part of the discussion, and it wasn't. But that being said, I appreciate the fact that I believe we're now at a place after this last decade where your federal agencies, your proponents, the tribes, we all know what we need to do to at least try and help Mother Earth turn back the clock a little bit. I don't even know if it's possible. I was relating to them. There's a place as you drive. It's a little bridge. It's called Harris Bridge, and it's in the place of Nashaquitza, and it attaches what is now Chilmark and Gay Head, Aquinnah. And over the last 2 years, there's docks from the homes there. In the last 2 years, every high tide, that water is right beneath the docks. And on a full moon, it's over. And when I was, maybe even 10 years ago, that did not happen. This is now a regular occurrence. Nothing against science, nothing against scientists, but I don't need to tell them to tell me something's going on. From animals, I just took a picture yesterday of a dandelion. I was actually on a site visit, and there's this little yellow dandelion sitting in the green grass. It's December 11th. And 2 days ago, we were having a snowstorm. This is unusual. When we listen, we don't necessarily listen to the TV. We listen to what's going on around us, what we see. Why are there birds calling at night in the middle of a snowstorm if it's not an owl? Why is this water high? It's going to take all of us to get this done. And the regulations and the laws, yes, they are there. But there's been a lot of times when they haven't been followed. We should do some of these things because they are the right thing to do. It's really very simple. What's not simple is the geotech, the geophysiology, all that stuff. That's what we need to learn. That's what we need to learn. But using all these tools will help us. It'll add to the history of the peoples of this place, those long ago peoples. You think about what they were living, the type of climate they were living in. You know, no grocery store. I don't even know how many people there were here, and how long did they travel? And then all of a sudden, one day the water started coming in. I know because Marshall dragged his toe and wanted to cut us off and make a place for us. But how does that relate in a timeline? 7,000 years ago, 10,000? That's how old that story is. Whenever that water came in, that's how old that story is that's been passed down to us. That I've now passed down to my son. That we've passed on to these 3- and 4-year-old children. And they have every right to stand up and repeat that and say, we were here. This is how long we've been here. The land under that water we once walked. Now we fish on it. The other responsibility we have is to speak for those who cannot speak in English, in French, in human tongue. I woke up to a text this morning that a whale had washed up on the beach for the second time in the last few months on the island. It's a right whale. They're very rare. What, 300, 350 in the world? When the numbers are that small, that's not a good thing. That can be catastrophic. So if a boat didn't hit it, what made it ill? Why did it die? And we come back to this. What's changed in the world? Even though we're going to be possibly finding new information, we are going to be creating structures in the water, and what will that do? And we have to think about these things and how those will change. And I don't know if you saw on the map, but all those little red things are planned wind projects, and they're sitting on the south of Martha's Vineyard. So that's our job, to work with all these agencies, to work with the scientists and archaeologists, to get the information that we need so these projects can move forward, hopefully, that we come to agreements. We come to agreements on sight lines, come to agreements on size. And these things can't happen overnight. There are discussions that not only I am involved with, but my government is involved with. And not only my government, but most of the southern New England tribes. It can be at times convoluted. It seems that way. But the tribes are willing to work together. We meet together. All the tribes will get together and sit down and talk with the federal agencies, or with Dr. King and Mr. Robinson, because we realize to meet with each of us would take too much time. If we need the time, we'll make sure we make a meeting if it's something important just to our tribe. And everyone is willing to do that, because I think in the end we all respect one another. And we certainly respect Mother Earth and for what she's given to us. And we haven't treated her very well. And we need to do all we can to try and help her, because in turn we help ourselves. Some of our philosophies are real simple, and we need to remember those things.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes, so we can open it up for questions from the audience. Thank you. Any questions?
No.
Yes.
I was
The question, just to repeat the question for the webinar, is the relationship between the Wampanoag Tribe and the Narragansett Indian Tribe.
So, are you sure? I'm just trying to clarify. You want to know between my Tribal Historic Office and the Narragansett Tribal Historic Office? Okay, because our tribal councils are our governments. All right. I was just with Mr. Harris the other day on another project. We work quite closely on most projects because you can see, well, not on that slide, but we're all in the same area. So usually, and what happened, well, obviously from history, you don't see a lot of federally recognized tribes here, but we've got Mohegan Nation, Mashantucket Pequot, Narragansett, Quinawampanoag, Mashpee Wampanoag. So there's 5 of us in the Southeast region. So most of the time, if there's a project, because we are so closely related, we're culturally related, we tend to work on projects together, if especially on the wind projects. Within our own areas, then we work, singularly. But Doug and I are probably in communication more than others at times. Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
This question is on a total ignorance.
Yeah.
But if there was land where there is now water, is there an explanation for that possibly? Is it more melting of the ice caps, or I don't know? I'm asking. Totally ignorant.
Just to repeat the question is, in cases where there is water, where there's land where water used, there's water where land used to be. Is there an explanation for that condition?
What explanation do you want? The scientific one? Okay. Well, the tribes have a different explanation. So I'll give you mine, then Bettina can give you hers. Basically, it's waxing and waning of ice sheets. When you have massive continental-size ice sheets on the land, that water comes out of the ocean, and we had the equivalent of about 400 feet or 130 meters worth of water come out of the ocean and be stored on land when the climate was colder, and then when the climate warmed up, it all melted and went back into the ocean.
Now you want my?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so our oral history. So where you see the Cape and you see the islands, well, that would all be land, and our oral history says, for whatever reason, we're not quite sure, Marshall, our leader, decided he'd had quite enough of living over in this area. Now, when we look back at older versions of our oral history, he was aware of this place, of what became Martha's Vineyard. He was aware of that place. He knew where he was going. But he said, whoever wants to come join me, come on. So he walked off, kind of like the elbow of the Cape, and he kept walking, and it started to get marshy. And he got really tired, and the people were kind of tired and stuff. So then he turned west. But he was tired, so he dragged his foot and his big toe. And as he dragged it, the water came in. So that water did exist. But how it got to become Vineyard Sound, that's how it became Vineyard Sound. And then he took us to the end of that. So I guess some folks, the question is, so where did the water come to the west? We don't have an answer for that. I know it was there and to the south because no man's land in our story is actually a crab that grabbed his toe and he threw it out there. Now, could that have been that ancient lake up in the Turner's Fall area when it melted and the Connecticut River brought that down and dumped it down through there? I don't know. I haven't looked to find out those stories, but that's how the Vineyard Sound and Nantucket Sound came to be. You're welcome.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Yes.
So,
Yeah.
and John and David, all of you have been involved in Block Island Wind Farm.
Yeah.
I actually get the question a lot, how should we engage with tribes before an application is submitted, and Section 106 process doesn't technically start until there's an application submitted. So there's this weird kind of limbo for a project proponent where you need to kind of go it your own. And so I guess just some thoughts on, some lessons learned from the work that, we've done to date on, and what works well. And as we think about having all of these projects and limited resources, just maybe some thoughts on what's worked well and what we might want to consider moving forward for that kind of, I'd say project proponents focus in a lot on this pre-application phase.
So the question is, in terms of the developer working with the tribes in relation to Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act, and doing all of the groundwork with the pre-application process, what is some lessons learned from past experience and some advice going forward? Thank you.
Me first?
Sure.
Thanks. Section 106. Let's just say it's a project on land, and it's a proponent. They'll go out and they'll have an archaeological survey done. The permit has not been approved, much less, or even applied for. But that's where the tribe needs to be, because now they're in digging. So the same thing applies on the ocean. It is an issue, because the proponent wants to do the right thing when they come and say, we want to engage with the tribe. The issue is the federal agency has not issued the permit yet. And that's kind of, that's our go-ahead to engage in this relationship. And it's not just, I want to be clear, it's not just with the wind farms. We have this with other federal agencies, especially, I think it's the gas line was the last time it came up for us. And what we ended up doing, and again, this is a kind of consultation. It's a meeting with the federal agency, and we state our concerns that we need to be protected for the information we're giving out and that we're involved with. And what we, in this particular case, ended up being a letter from the agency to the proponent to work with the tribe. In this case, actually, the proponent wasn't as willing, and but they said, nope, you work with the tribe. And then we took that good faith effort and worked with the proponent. And because what it did, it got us to where we needed to be in terms of those first steps. And it allowed the proponent to get the permit they needed. This is a rather unique in this particular agency way they do things. Obviously now that once you've worked with a proponent, that also makes it, I would say, easier, because you know one another, you know how they work, they know how to get hold of you. And consultation is just like anything else. It's a relationship. It can be a relationship you have with a federal agency. That can be good or not so good. And then you work on that relationship. It's with a proponent. And if you have a proponent that has a project and doesn't listen to you, and they end up going through an important archaeological site, that's a problem. Because if they have to go for another project, you're going to be on watching them with your eye teeth. But you have to work on that relationship. So in order, in cases like this, it may have to be a meeting where you sit down with the proponent and the tribe or tribes and that federal agency, so everyone is on the same page. Because it's really the permit that they need. It's the permit that they want. but the tribe wants to be there before that. It can be done because we've done it. It's just that everybody needs to be on that same page and know what the limitations are and where it's going and what everybody's job is.
Great, thank you. Any last comments from our panel?
I would only add just very briefly that what we found in doing the research that we did was that, yes, consultation is a relationship. It's a legal relationship. It's got protocols and procedures that are a part of it. But in order for it to really be effective and work well, it has to be, the relationship has to be more than that. There has to be a level of care, a level of knowledge between the different groups that are engaging one another for it to work optimally. And I would give, as the archaeologist who worked on the marine portion of I worked on Cape Wind too, but on the Deepwater Wind project with Aileen on Block Island, that I very much felt that they cared about what the tribe's concerns were and proceeded accordingly. And because of that, things went much more smoothly than you see on other projects. So it's really a pretty simple thing. Care for the people that are part of your community that you're trying to work with. So that's all I have.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, we're going to get started. All right. Well, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Tracy Dalton. I'm the chair of the Marine Affairs Department here at URI. In Marine Affairs, we study people. So we study what people think. We study how they interact with coastal and marine areas. We study how they govern and manage those interactions through processes, through laws and policies, and through other arrangements. And as we've heard about over the past 2 days, people play a very important role in the wind farm story. We've heard, as we just heard in our last session, the tribes play an important role. We've heard from fishermen, regulators, many scientists, and many others, residents, all sorts of folks involved in this issue. And I am really excited to be the moderator today for this session that's going to showcase some of the social science research that has been going on related to wind farms. The panelists today are at the cutting edge of some of this work. You'll find that some of the research that's being presented on social science research is a little more recent than some of the ecological research that's been presented the past few days. But the social science in this area is really gaining momentum. So before I turn it over to the panelists, I just wanted to make a quick mention about some of the research that I've been working on with some of my colleagues. We have been, at this point, we don't have any research findings to share, but we have been collecting data. And so
We've been conducting interviews with recreational and commercial fishermen, and some are in the audience. We have been developing a survey of recreational boaters. So I just wanted to take a quick moment, take this opportunity to thank those of you that have participated in the interviews. We are working on data analysis, and we will share our findings as we move forward. But now, on to the important part. I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. We've got a wonderful panel with some amazing research to share. They're going to talk a little bit about the research they're doing, share some of their findings to date, and I will introduce them briefly. So the first speaker is going to be Amelia Moore. She's one of my colleagues in the Marine Affairs Department. She's an assistant professor of Marine Affairs. David Bidwell is also an assistant professor of Marine Affairs. And Gordon Perkins is the visual specialist at EDR. And with that, I will give it over to them.
Hello and good afternoon, and thank you all for your patience and still being here today. I'm hopefully going to be able to use this correctly. So I'm Amelia Moore at Marine Affairs at URI, and I'm going to walk you through, really briefly, work that some of us have been doing in Marine Affairs. Two of my Marine Affairs colleagues, two people from Marine Affairs, myself, David Bidwell, also Holly Smith, who's just joined our department, and then also colleagues from CRC, Tiffany Smythe, and Jen McCann are on this project. It's a BOEM-funded project, and our project is studying the effects of the Block Island Wind Farm on the recreation, tourism, and Block Island experience. And so it's a 2-year project. We have just finished our first year of work, so we're halfway through this project. And the purpose of the project is to document the effects of the Block Island Wind Farm on recreation and tourism in order to ultimately try to identify some measurable indicators, and this could be measurable in a variety of ways, that signal particular kinds of effects on tourism and for the larger scaling up of offshore wind in the country. So we're looking at Block Island to try to find indicators of effects on the offshore and coastal recreation and tourism industry. So Block Island is kind of a test site to see what the tourism dynamics and relationships are with this offshore wind, and to see what we can generalize from that moving forward. And this project has multiple components. And it started with a literature review that we all did together, looking for background literature on the interaction between wind farms onshore and offshore and the tourism industry. And this is an ongoing process of searching the literature. We also did a content analysis. That's a portion of the project, which was searching through news media about the Block Island Wind Farm over the last few years, and the database. And creating a database of information coming out of that record. I'm going to talk to you briefly about participant observation today, which is a fieldwork method. Then there's also focus groups that some of you have been involved in as well, with multiple sectors within the coastal tourism industry. And then that culminates in the indicator development process, which we are working on doing collaboratively as a team. So combining these multiple components into the development of both quantitative and qualitative indicators. So participant observation, that's the component of the project that I'm involved in, and I am a cultural anthropologist, a qualitative social scientist, and participant observation is one of my main methods for data collecting in real time. So that means that I am observing people engaging in their everyday activities, and I'm participating in those everyday activities. And in the context of this project, that meant that myself and my team, consisting of some of my colleagues and also students, were out participating and engaging in coastal tourism and recreation. So I like to joke that we were recreating our hearts out over the last year to try to figure out what the relationship with the turbines and the wind farm and the coastal tourism experience is like. And it's different from asking people to describe their experience when they're not doing it. It's actually having that experience with them in real time. And so you can find out things that people don't necessarily articulate into words. And you can also watch people kind of making decisions on the fly. And so then you create a large database of notes and information based on these experiences that you've had. So some of the things that we've been participating in and observing are tours. We've taken a lot of tours in the past season. We've done a lot of recreating on the mainland and also on Block Island. So a lot of beach going, sunbathing. We've done a lot of biking. We've done a lot of walking. We've done a lot of ferry riding. We've done a lot of other kinds of boating, some charter fishing, and we have even done some shopping. So like I said, recreating our hearts out. It's very exhausting. It's really difficult work. And one thing that so I'm going to go through just some initial findings. Produces a lot of information. Some initial findings that we need to, I need to talk this through with my collaborators on the project, and we need to decide what we want to focus on for the next year of the project, and I'll come back to that. But so just some things to think about. This photo, I think, is kind of indicative of what people's relationship to the wind farm is like. So in this photo, you'll notice there are some people that are laser beam focused on the wind farm, or at least they appear to be, kind of very fascinated about it, curious, taking photos of it. And then you have others who couldn't really be bothered to notice it or care about it in any way. This is, I think, if you could summarize our first year of participant observation in a nutshell in terms of the kind of observations of tourists, this would be the dynamics that we're noticing. One thing I want to say is that tourists is not a homogeneous group. There are people who have never been to Rhode Island before who are out here on the coast for the day, who have never heard of the wind farm, and there are people who have been coming and recreating in the coastal area for their entire lives or for many, many years, and who are heavily financially invested and emotionally invested in the landscape, and those are very different populations. So part of what I said we were doing is taking tours. This is a picture from the Block Island Ferry tour. The Block Island Ferry has been experimenting with taking tours, as some of our some panelists from earlier in the day mentioned. And this has been pretty popular, and we'll be interested to know what their plans are for next season. But the experience of taking a tour is very different from the kind of mainland experience of the turbines, of the wind farm, which is almost to not pay any attention to it or even be able to see the wind farm on most days from the mainland. And even from southern Block Island, the wind farm is very dramatic, as you could see in this photo. You can see the turbines immediately offshore. They have a presence, but if you take a tour, you're having a totally different experience with them. And so you get, for some things that we've documented from a tour like this, is a lot of commentary. People say that they are gigantic. People say that they are majestic. There's a lot of oohs and ahs, and there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of photographing. There's a lot of phones being used to take pictures, and that's people are engaging with the turbines in this way. And one of the comments from people leaving this tour was that, oh, that was a great day, or this was a great time on the water. So there are some people for whom the turbines definitely are a draw. So I bring this up to say that the turbines are becoming, and to some degree, a tourism product in themselves. And this is something that might be obvious to some of you, but for some that are not as familiar with the area, there's a lot of fear as to how the turbines would impact the kind of iconic tourism landscape of the coastal area around Block Island and coastal Rhode Island. And for some people, it is absolutely a draw. It is becoming a destination in itself, which is something that we speculated about before this project, and I think we've been surprised to see how true that really is becoming. And then this picture on the left is a photo from taking a smaller boat, a charter tour boat, out to the turbines, which is a business that has been started completely opportunistically around the wind farm. It's also a very visceral experience, even more so. This is probably one of the ways that people can get the closest to the turbines a regular person can. It's more expensive, but people have said that it's almost like a prehistoric feeling. Somebody said that, which we think means that you're close to something large and something mysterious, and that you have a real visceral reaction to being close to something that big. And then on the right, there's a picture of from the Southeast Lighthouse looking out to the turbines, and the people at the lighthouse. That the lighthouse has been one of the most popular tourist destinations on Block Island, and the lighthouse is getting a lot of, people are very curious about the turbines, so they're getting a lot of attention at the lighthouse. So the docents there who give the tours have incorporated the turbines into their tours, and that's something that they've noticed. And so one thing I want to say before I run out of time is that, while the turbines are becoming a tourism product in themselves, which is something that we'll be following, it's an unevenly distributed product in terms of its benefits. So people who already have established businesses are kind of most likely to be able to capitalize on this, it seems. So the Block Island Ferry was already there. They could add extra runs and make some money off of it. This person who's running the charter boats already had a business. That's something that we're going to keep an eye on moving forward, is to what extent this new destination or new addition to the coastal recreation list of amenities is kind of, the benefits are spread around the region. And I'm out of time, but I just wanted to really quickly talk about the next steps. So for participant observation, again, we have another year to go. So we're going to I'm going to talk through all of this data collection from the last year with a team. Then we're going to make recommendations for next year. We're going to do the second year of participant observation. We're going to create a final summary of participant observation fieldwork in the final report for the project. But overall for the project, we've already done an initial round of focus groups. We're going to do a follow-up round of focus groups. Then we're going to get together and integrate all of these components in order to prepare the recommendations for the final indicators. So some of you we might involve in this project moving forward if you haven't been involved already, and I look forward to that in the future. Great. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm going to guess that the arrow forward means go forward and the arrow back means go back. All right. Yep, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Amelia. As Amelia said, I'm involved in some of this qualitative work that's going on around tourism and recreation. I'm actually going to talk to you about some different things today, something that's more quantitative in some of the work that I do outside of the BOEM-funded project as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about public perspectives on the Block Island wind farm. I'm going to do something a little bit different. I know Jen asked us to do lessons about the work that we've been doing or the research that we've been working on. I'm going to start out with lessons instead of ending with them. When people find out what it is that I study and what I'm working on, the natural first question is always, well, what do people think about the Block Island wind farm? Which is, of course, a terrible question because it's really hard to answer. People, of course, think lots of things about the Block Island wind farm. Even if you separate people out by supporters and opponents, they may have very different reasons why they support or oppose the project as well. And some people actually hold two contradictory opinions in their mind at the same time, right? So there might be different levels of ambivalence. They may support the project, but they may have some misgivings. They may oppose the project, but they see some benefits as well. The second part is that symbolism matters. People often talk about aesthetics as to whether or not people like the way that the turbines look, but oftentimes what is affecting that message of how people like or don't like the way it looks has a lot to do with how they are interpreting the meaning of the turbines, or how they're interpreting the meanings of the oceans, et cetera. And that gets to the third point, which is that those general values, the principles that you have that control things that you do in your life, or things that you want to do in your life, or that you think are important, also influence your attitudes about the wind farm. And then finally, something that you see a lot in renewable social science is that sometimes the anticipation of something, or the worry about something that's on the horizon, can sometimes be worse than the actual product itself. So I'm going to talk about 3 different studies. It's really 2 different studies, but one of them I'm going to tell you a couple different approaches to analysis on them. So first, I want to give you a little bit of context. Okay? So people have been trying to understand what people think about for renewable energy for a long time. And one of the dominant narratives in this is, if you just go around and you ask people what they think about renewable energy, most people are pro-renewable energy. And so why is it that people oppose projects when they're proposed, or when they're trying to be built? And one of the typical things that you hear up here is this NIMBY phrase, right? Not in my backyard. We had somebody already allude to this with yes in my backyard, right? There's a couple of reasons that social science has sort of dismissed this idea of NIMBY. One is it doesn't tell you very much. So if people oppose it being in their backyard, why is that, right? So we need to understand more about that. The other is that sometimes NIMBY is used as a pejorative. It implies in some way that people are putting their personal interests above the greater good. And so people use it as a way of sort of discounting what the public thinks. So people have urged a much more nuanced point of view of what people think. And there is a large public acceptance literature around wind and around renewables. And they've come up, yes, there probably are some people who are self-interested and don't like the project, or do like the project out of self-interest. It may be that there's a democratic deficit going on. It may be a small number of people who oppose, or a small number of people who support, but their voices are really loud. It's the squeaky wheel syndrome. A lot of people have turned to this idea of conditional support. People support the projects, but they don't support any project, and they don't support any form of the project, but they have conditions around that. A lot of attention paid to place attachment, or the protection of special places in people's lives. And that gets to some of this idea of these underlying values and symbolism as well. In this world of wind energy, some people have said, well, to get rid of some of these problems and opponents, right, let's stick them offshore. That'll get rid of some of these issues. But what we find is, of course, offshore projects face many of the same stresses that onshore projects find as well, and we've certainly seen that in the US around projects such as Cape Wind. Okay. The first project is trying to understand what coastal residents think about the Block Island Wind Farm. And this is a project I've been involved in with Jeremy Firestone, who's a scholar at the University of Delaware. And what we've been doing are some mail and internet surveys, random samples of folks, on Block Island itself, in a strata of census blocks right along the ocean where you can see the turbines, and then sort of the next group of areas inside from that. So far we've done 2 waves of this survey. One was before the towers went up, and one was after operation has already been there. And this is longitudinal, so those 420 are of this 676. So the numbers that I'm going to show you, the percentages have been weighted. Great. And then some of we've done regression analysis too that's unweighted. So here are the things that we found on that study. There's substantial support for the project. Okay, you get up in the neighborhood of 80% support or leaning support for the project in all of those strata. Okay. For the strata that's bordering the ocean on the mainland, okay, we actually seen, that's the only strata where we saw a lot of movement in attitudes from before the towers went up to after. And as you can see, there was a significant amount of change in terms of level of support. If you want to characterize the opponents, some of the things that most characterize people who oppose the project is that they disagree that the turbines fit in the landscape, and they don't like the way that they look. Okay, so that's going to be important for our third talk as well. And the symbolic meanings are important, okay? And this, just to show you a little bit of data, you can see here, these are people on Block Island, and this is people on the mainland sort of smushed together. And you can see this idea that the turbines are symbolic progress towards clean energy is a major reason for why people are supporting the project. And on the flip side, for the opponents, this idea of losing something intangible and where all you see is the ocean and uninterrupted view is important. But you'll also see some play where supporters also agree that you're losing something intangible, okay? Or opponents also think that it's symbolic progress towards clean energy. So again, people are a little more complex than we normally think. The second set of studies that I just want to give you a little taste of, these are intercept surveys. Dave was here before. I don't know if he's still here now. These are students actually out on the island in different locations, and they're talking to people as they come up and asking them to do the survey. They do it in a systematic way to try to ease some of the bias in the study. So for this first bit, this is just data from 2015. And this fits into sort of theoretically the kinds of things that I'm interested in. So this is based on 624 complete surveys, which includes visitors, full-time and seasonal residents. Okay, so it's a little bit of everyone looking at things. And this has already been published in Ocean and Coastal Management. This is based on this idea that these large cognitive structures that we have influence our beliefs about things, that influence our attitudes and our behavior. For this study, we're looking at these values. And the beliefs are beliefs about the ocean and what's important about the ocean, and then what your anticipated impacts are about the wind farm project. What we find in this study is that your anticipated impacts, do you think the project is going to have benefits or it's going to cause problems for both natural resources and socioeconomics, is the biggest indicator of whether you support the project or not. Okay? But those beliefs are also influenced by your beliefs about what the ocean is for, what's important about the ocean, okay? As well as your overall support. You probably aren't surprised that people who see the ocean as for consumptive purposes, right, for creating food, creating energy, commerce, they're more supportive of the wind farm. This is fairly consistent in some of my other work as well. People who have altruistic values, so values that transcend self, that you think of the importance of others, that tends to lead to more support, whereas traditional values, which are about the current social order and supporting the current social order, tend to lead to less support. Okay, the final piece, this is about tourists, and we've talked about that from a qualitative standpoint in the panel today. This is based on 3 years of intercept data, so it's around 1,100 completed surveys. And for this, it's just visitors and the seasonal residents. They self-declare themselves as being visitors to the island or seasonal residents. And here are the things that we find from just looking at those two groups. One, we see fairly moderate levels of support from these groups. So if you look, like 73% of that sample either slightly to strongly support the project. And only 10% have feelings of opposition. Some of the things that support, some of the things that lead to the support, age and income, the older you are and the higher your income, the more support for this once you control for everything. Democrats more supportive than Republicans. Again, altruism and traditionalism. And visitors more supportive than seasonal residents. That does not surprise some people, I'm sure. And this one I find really interesting. People who say that they have seen either the construction activities before the project was completed, or people who say that they've seen it operate, more supportive than those people who say that they haven't, once you control for all of those other factors. So that's it, just quick acknowledgments. The mail surveys is from some funding that Jeremy got from First State Marine, and then my stuff is supported by a hatch project here at URI and the students who've worked on it as well. Thank you.
Thanks to David and Amelia, and contrary to Amelia's experience out on the beach, I'm the only guy out there that is fully clothed with high-tech camera equipment in the middle of August, so you can imagine how people feel about me being out there. I'm just going to quickly go through some of the advancements in technology since the Block Island Wind Farm was built, and also those advancements in the technology for visual assessment that have directly resulted from research on the Block Island Wind Project. Just getting started, I want to set a precedent for exactly what we're trying to do with visual assessment. And the goal here is, in the planning stages of wind projects, we want to make sure that the environment that they're being built in and that the onshore resources can absorb the visual change presented by that project being installed without significantly impacting scenic quality or viewer enjoyment of those resources. It's not subjective. It's beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We understand that, but we take a scientific approach that breaks the environment, the visual environment, down into its bare elements to figure out exactly how they are affected by the project before the project is built. So I'm just going to go through briefly the overall VIA process and then touch on the specific points where we've made advancements as a result of Block Island. So the process starts out with developing what's known as an area of potential effect, or APE. And we do that through the use of viewshed analysis. That's one of the first things we're going to touch on here. We've heard a lot about engaging stakeholders and building a relationship. That's a very important part of visual impact assessment. Understanding those resources that are important to people, how we document those resources, and then continuing an ongoing conversation about what the visually sensitive resources are and how those work into Section 106 considerations for onshore historic and cultural resources. And we don't just say what's important to you and drop it. We continue that conversation. We make sure that we've captured what those individuals and stakeholders are looking for. We identify landscape similarity zones, and that sort of takes the landscape as a whole and breaks it out into similar portions. So for example, coastal scrub, beach, dune landscapes, bluffs, and things of that nature. So we take those out and we divide them up into segments so that they can be analyzed as a whole. And then we identify key observation points. Those are locations from which we would generally do simulations, which would demonstrate what the project would look like after it's built. Then we go out and do field photography, survey, and videography, my favorite part of the process, because we get to visit beautiful places. Who can complain about that? And then line of sight cross sections, curvature of the earth models. This is something, it's a new consideration. Typically when doing visual impact assessment for onshore resources, we don't have to think about curvature of the earth, but when we're dealing with projects that could be up to 30 miles from the viewer, curvature of the earth is a very big consideration. And that's one thing that we've really followed up on the Block Island Wind Farm after it was constructed, and we viewed it from several different locations to verify our desktop models to make sure that we're portraying it accurately. Then we jump right into visual simulations, and then it goes to a professional rating panel, and this is where the science comes into the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. This rating panel takes all of the information that we provided, breaking down into landscape similarity zones, KOPs, and the culturally sensitive resources, and they take all of that information and they essentially apply scores to existing views, and then they score the proposed view. And that is all totaled up, and then all of that is presented in a report and in our results. So moving right along, this is viewshed analysis, and I took a very basic example. We dropped a 25-foot pole in the middle of a field, and using traditional viewshed analysis, we wanted to figure out where that pole would be visible from. So this is based on topography only. Very simple analysis, very quick. So of 125 acres, 97.6 would have visibility of that pole in the middle of that field where the blue dot is. Moving along, we can add a new element into this, and that's through the use of NLCD data, which is National Land Cover Database. The entire country is mapped with this data, and what we do is we separate everything that is vegetated, and we use that as a screening structure. So that's what it looks like when we consider vegetation. And essentially what this viewshed analysis is doing is analyzing every single cell in that grid data and determining whether or not it has a direct line of sight of that pole in the middle of a field. So this knocks it down to 54.3%, which is significant. But then, since the construction of the Block Island Wind Project, we've got a huge amount of really detailed data called LIDAR, and that basically covers the entire mid-Atlantic coast as a result of some of the hurricane relief funding that's come into place. That mapping is much more complete now. And so we're able to run a viewshed analysis now that paints a really accurate picture of what visibility is going to be. And again, of the 125 acres, we've now narrowed our APE down to 11.5 acres, or 9.1%. The reason I'm showing this example is because our most recent visual impact assessment considered a study area of 3.5 million acres. And so by using LIDAR data, we were able to really narrow down that potential APE where resources could potentially be affected, and that means that we can now focus all of our energy on just those areas that have visibility. It significantly narrowed our scope of study. And this is just a quick example of what that LIDAR data looks like. So it considers houses, vegetation, all the way down to curb lines. Everything that could potentially impact visibility is considered in LIDAR. Jumping right into field verification, it's not just going out and photographing a site. We need to capture the essence of that place. What makes it culturally significant? What gives it its historical significance? And you need to capture that setting or sense of place so that people understand, one, where you're taking the picture, and it also captures those elements that are not only recognizable to them, but that are also important to them culturally and visually. At each of the locations that we photograph when we develop our KOPs, and of course we develop these in conjunction with all of the stakeholders, tribal councils, and that ongoing relationship with all the agencies involved. We go out and we shoot photographs using specialty camera equipment and survey equipment so that we can accurately pinpoint the location and understand all of the variables that go into creating a simulation. The more knowns you have, the more accurate of a simulation you can have. We also use drones in setting up offshore beacons so that we can increase the accuracy of our directional bearings and survey points. And then jumping right into curvature of the Earth models, this is where we went to a multitude of locations. The top one is representative of, I'm sorry, this is a generic example. So the bottom one here is actually representative of Cuttyhunk Island looking at the Block Island wind farm. And one thing you'll notice is that at 35 miles, you're barely seeing the tops of the turbines. And we also photographed it from that location. And the really interesting, Cuttyhunk is a great place to survey because you've got, longtime residents that enjoy views around there all the time. And when I was up doing this work on Cuttyhunk, every single one of those residents came by and spoke to me while I was up there and asked me what I was doing. And when I told them I was photographing the Block Island wind farm, they thought I was crazy because they simply could not see it. And of course, here I'm shooting with a 1200 millimeter lens. There are certain times of day where it becomes visible when the sun hits it just right, just before setting behind the horizon. And they tend to shine for a couple of minutes before completely disappearing again. And then, of course, at nighttime, because it's a point source of light, your eye is going to receive that generally no matter what distance you're at under clear conditions. And this is that same shot taken at 50 millimeters. So this is what the viewer would experience. So the project completely disappears from view here. Similar shot from Brent Point State Park. If you focus on those fishermen in the midground there, those same fishermen are right there, I believe. So again, at this location, I informally interviewed a lot of residents and tourists that were walking around, and until you point out the wind farm, they simply couldn't see it. So just very quickly, what we've learned from this, we've been able to verify our theoretical models based on, that predict curvature of the Earth. Excellent opportunity to gather public opinion, as Amelia and David spoke about. Beyond 20 miles, it becomes very difficult to discern the turbines for the average viewer. Elevated views have the highest potential of visibility, no surprise there. Turbine movement is difficult to discern, which is an important consideration. FAA signals are the most visible portion of a wind farm, especially at night, well, only at nighttime. Coast Guard signals are generally of minimal significance due to the curvature of the Earth and diminishment over distance. And then long-distance viewing is impacted by atmospheric changes and background sky color. Formal public surveys, obviously, we think that's a really important part to understanding visual impact assessment. Rating panel reviews, we want to get rating panels out there so that they can see built projects. We want to increase the realism of simulations based on actual observations. And then we would like to continue with atmospheric and visibility monitoring to understand how humidity and other environmental changes impact visibility. Thank you.
I have to keep pulling this way down. Thank you, panelists. Because we only have about 15 minutes or so for questions, I'd love to open it up to the audience and see if anybody wants to start it off with some questions. Yes?
So I think the last speaker got to my point directly, but I'm wondering if the other two speakers could indulge us and extrapolate from the Block Island experience, which I would argue is unique, to the projects that are likely to be much farther away, not necessarily focused on one community, and how they might affect both the recreation, tourism, and perception in that very different context. Is there any way you can take the information you have and sort of speculate on that?
And just to repeat the question, he's wondering what your studies, if you can extrapolate from your studies, what they might provide in terms of some insights for some of the other wind farms that are proposed and moving forward.
Well, one thing that I think is pretty obvious is that the coastal Rhode Island mainland experience is probably going to be more in line with what other states and other coastal areas are going to deal with in terms of kind of tourism relationships to an offshore wind farm. I think the mainland experience of, and I think you have some information about this as well in terms of people you've been speaking to, but the mainland experience, now that they are built, is of, conditions being such that much of the time you can't actually see them. And a lot of people who are involved in the tourism industry in the mainland don't really feel like it affects them in any really measurable way. If they have like coastline-based businesses. If you're out on the water, that's different. But if you're on land, that's, I think from my study at least, the mainland portion is probably more like what the larger regional experience is going to be. And then also, yeah, I think we're very aware that Block Island is unique. The wind farm is very accessible from Block Island, so the capacity to develop wind farm-based businesses or to have stickers like this one that say Block Island, Rhode Island with the wind farm on it to try to make the wind farm, to kind of experiment with marketing to make the wind farm kind of part of the community or the island sense of place is not necessarily something that other coastal communities are going to be able to figure out how to do as well. I think people will maybe try, but that'll be something interesting to follow as well. But I think for Block Island, it is pretty, it's definitely unique in that way.
So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that, you know, being able to see 5 turbines on the horizon is going to be different than being able to see 40 or 30, right? It is going to be different. We are going to be really interested. We're going to do a 3rd phase of that longitudinal survey to see how that holds up. And I think Amelia is exactly right, which is those people who are living on the shore of the mainland who are going to tell us more that could be applied to those other projects as well. And whether, you know, I do think, and Amelia will probably confirm this, that she's been hearing from people it's not as bad as we thought it was going to be. Right? That's something we actually hear from people over and over. And I think that may be in part what we're seeing. I showed you the change in support of the project for those mainland census tracts right on the coast. And there may be some of that like, oh, I thought it was going to look really awful, but it doesn't look that awful. Really just as an anecdotal thing also that I think is really interesting is that people are now using the wind farm as a sign of how good the weather is. So it used to be from the mainland, oh, it was a really clear day, you could see Montauk, right? Now it's, oh, it was a really clear day, you could see the wind turbines. Because frankly, there are days when they just are not there at all. You as much as you strain, you can't see them. So it is interesting that it's taking on this sort of symbolic role in some way as an indicator of the quality of the day, whether you can see them or not. So that it's a little different. But again, it's going to depend on who that person is and how they feel about the turbines and part of how they're going to interpret what that visual impact is.
Gordon, did you want to add anything to that, or?
No, I think pretty much captured it.
All right. All right, up in the back.
I'm a Block Island resident. Has there been any studies done on the impact on us? You're focusing on tourism and recreation. What about Block Island?
So as part of this study, we are absolutely talking to residents who are more so those that are engaged in the tourism industry in some way, but who are people who are residents and who are year-round long-term residents. And that didn't, you know, you can't talk about everything or even, you know, most of everything in a quick 10-minute presentation. But yes, that's absolutely a component of the research. And as I was trying to mention, you know, the difference between tourists, like tourists are not a homogeneous population. You know, the people who are on Block Islanders are not a homogeneous population either. And there are really interesting dynamics there. I think David's work shows kind of the range of demographics and how those relate to feelings of support or different parameters around the wind farm, and he can obviously speak more to that. But yes, we care about you as well.
But I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of room for more understanding about things.
Yep.
This is probably specifically for Gordon, but how do you feel about the efficacy of using photo simulations in advance of the project for assuaging people's concern? I hear you say, oh, it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. What's your experience with utilizing photo simulations as an educational tool?
Please repeat the question.
One of us can.
Okay, so you're asking, how do I feel about using visual simulations as either as a tool so people can understand what the project will look like? And I think it's the only tool. You know, right now it's the best technology we have to demonstrate how a project will appear. You can add other elements to that. You can say this is how often you'll likely see it based on past meteorological data. But I think it's very important to understand that it's not just putting a piece of paper in front of somebody with the turbines on it or, you know, placed on a photograph. Visual simulations it's a very in-depth process. You have to make sure that you survey every component in those photographs to make sure that you're producing something that's of proper scale. And then even when you view it, there are actually viewing parameters to make sure that people look at them correctly from the correct distance to gain the right perspective. So I think there's all sorts of guidance that you can offer people that are viewing these. In addition to that, we're also, more and more now we're using video simulations so that the movement is apparent when presenting simulations. We're getting into high-resolution immersive environments, so utilizing VR to be able to demonstrate what projects look like. But right now, I think that simulations and video simulations really are the only tool to demonstrate what a project is going to look like.
Just to chip in, I wish I wish I could remember exactly who it was I was talking to, but I know there's also people who've been doing work on, does the size of the screen on which people are looking at the simulations, does that matter, right? Like how much bias is based into this depending on how people are viewing them. I would say we now have a terrific tool at our disposal beyond simulations for people to know what wind turbines look like in the US from a particular distance, right? So I think using some of that in the region and bringing people out here and seeing what they look like, I think is also important, not just as sort of as a sales point, but in terms of understanding how people from other locations are viewing, what do you actually think about this impact? Because again, you can have what it actually looks like in a physical way, but how people are thinking about whether that's a burdensome impact or not is going to be the important piece.
Actually, David, that's a great point, and it brings me back to when we were doing land-based projects in their infancy in New York. When these projects came in, once the first project in New York State was built, developers used to bus stakeholders of future projects to those built projects so they could understand scale and perception.
And yeah, I think that just really quickly, I think it's having the actual turbines there to think about things beyond the visual also, like the kind of what it actually feels like to look at something, like you're looking at it, but you're feeling it as well. This is something that you can only do with field work, and I think it's been wonderful to have that opportunity.
Corey?
I had another question for Gordon. I was wondering if you'd done the viewshed analysis, including LiDAR, for Block Island, and what proportion of the island can see?
We did not actually, unfortunately, or fortunately, at the time, there was very little of coastal Massachusetts included in the LiDAR data. We performed the visual impact assessment for Block Island in 2011, and much of that really detailed DSM data came 2012 to 2014. And so we used bare earth topography with NLCD vegetation, which it did narrow down the study area, but not as much as LiDAR would have.
And from that limited analysis, what proportion could see the turbines?
I believe, so the limited analysis, I believe the topography revealed about 83% of the land study area had visibility. When we included vegetation, I think it narrowed it down to about 23%. Don't quote me on that, though.
I'm going to just cut into just a little interesting story, and I don't know how much the Block Islanders can tell us. I heard someone refer to them as rabbit ears a couple of weeks ago, because there are parts of the island where what you see are the blades poking up over something. So, when you're talking about can you see it, what you can see is very different depending on where you are as well.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
Just a question for David, just about language. You showed a slide that said, I don't know, 73, 74% of Block Island is supported the project, but you labeled that as moderate support. I was kind of surprised that you would use that word.
I did, yeah. That has more to do with the mean on a 7-point scale. I think it was like a 5.3 or 5.6 on a 7-point scale, which is kind of like in the middle ground if you have from slightly support to strongly support. It was kind of in that middle range in terms of a mean, which is why I called it moderate support. But yeah, you're right. It's all depends on how you interpret that number, right?
Great. Well, let's thank our panelists.
Okay, folks, we're ready to kick off the next to the last panel here. Other than the wrap-up, we did save the best for the last. So this is a largely deep water panel, which, you know, are the whole reason that we're here. My name is Nils Bolgen. I'm a Offshore Wind Program Director at Mass Clean Energy Center. The panel here is on engineering, construction, operation, and maintenance of the Block Island Wind Farm, lessons that were learned. I want to just provide 1 minute of just a little bit of context. Our purpose here is to basically help us all understand from a technical standpoint, the various stages and the complexities of designing, deploying, and operating an offshore wind farm. I think understanding these complexities will help us understand how to understand what the impacts will be, how severe they will be, and maybe what can be done to avoid them in a project. The panel is Chris Van Beek, the president of Deepwater Wind. He's got a deep background in offshore construction, hailing from the Netherlands, and he managed all construction-related activities for the Block Island project and other projects coming. Then, well, working down the panel, we have Rain Byers. She is with ABS Consulting. That is the firm that provided the certified verification agent services to the project. And Rain was the project manager for ABS Consulting. And she's got a ton of experience with wind energy development on land and wind energy technology. And then at the far end is Captain John O'Keefe, who, that's what it says here, is basically a professional mariner and has served as the overseeing the operation and maintenance of the Block Island Wind Farm and sort of all marine affairs related to for deepwater wind. So the format, so Chris is going to lead us through a presentation showing sort of all the various aspects of designing and deploying the Block Island Farm, and Chris will call in Rain and John for various subsets of that. And then we'll take questions. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Niels. Let's see how this works. It works. First, I think we have to say it's a special day today because we have a birthday. Exact 365 days ago, the 12th of December, the construction of the Block Island Wind Farm was completed. And exactly. So we have 365 days of operation and pretty successful operation. So we are pretty proud on what is there, and we look forward to the next 19 years of operation. In this presentation, I hope to show that there is a lot of interaction on building a wind farm. John is our O&M manager and was also the logistic manager, but O&M, operations and maintenance, is very critical in the construction phase because it's easy to do cheap things and you deliver, but it doesn't last for 20 years. And that's not so good for the O&M manager. So to have a good balance on a thorough construction that will operate reliably for 20 years and having the input of the asset manager and the O&M manager is key in a project. And the same is for the CVA. The CVA stands for the Certified Verification Agent. We need to have that, but we want to have that as well, because you need an independent third party who is reviewing all your work and is doing some independent analysis that we don't make mistakes. So we know that the wind farm is designed in the right way. And that design has quite some implications for every aspect of the wind farm, and we hope to show you that in this presentation. So, of course, it all starts with the right criteria. And that sounds easy, but it's not so easy, because if you talk in Rhode Island about the weather, you can talk about that for a long time. And what is the storm, and what's the prediction, and can it survive hurricanes? And it goes on and on and on. Fortunately, there are some criteria that we handled. So it's important that you have the right start for the design loads of your wind farm, and that you have your independent third party who is verifying that. So for the Block Island wind farm, the design conditions were that we handled and we analyzed the 100-year return storm. I must say, in Europe, the standard is the 50-year return storm. So every wind farm in Europe is designed for the 50-year return storm, and that's the design criteria. Because in the United States you have hurricane conditions, you don't have that in Europe, though the storms are pretty severe there as well. We agreed that the wind farm will be designed for a 100-year return storm. And then you do the full analysis and history, and then you come up with that criteria. And you do hurricane conditions and non-hurricane conditions. So that turned out for the Block Island wind farm in 100 miles per hour for the 100-year return. And a little bit compared to Superstorm Sandy, the maximum gust in that one was 90 miles per hour, and that was in New Jersey. Here it was even less. Also, the wave height is important. So the 100-year return wave height is 50 feet. But we all know that storms become more severe in the future. It's not the same anymore. So there's also a check of your wind farm for the 1,000-year return storm. And that results in about 120 miles per hour. The third element, and that's just as important, specifically for fabrication installation, is the fatigue analysis of your wind farm. The design life is 25 years, and the amount of cycles with a turbine spinning there on top of your foundation is enormous. So overall, I think we did 5,000 load cases for this wind farm, and had a thorough check on the fatigue life of the wind farm. And we demonstrated that the worst node of the wind farm had a fatigue life of 25 years. The CVA verified the criteria, and we worked hard on that. And also, you can have discussion, well, you pay the CVA, so, why are they independent? But they report independent to the CRMC. And I see Anne sitting there. And I think we had a great cooperation with ABS, the CRMC, working together on making sure that the design of the wind farm and the construction was done in the right way. So I think this is the moment I pull Rain in. And she explains a little bit, with the starting points I mentioned, what has been done on the design of the wind farm.
Okay, Chris, thank you for that good overview. I don't want to repeat what you said, but let me add a little bit to what you said. So the CVA, our duty is to independently review and validate some of the key aspects of the design, also the manufacturing and the installation and commissioning of the wind farm. In this jurisdiction, in Rhode Island state waters, those duties are described in the Rhode Island Ocean SAMP, and as Chris said, we report directly to the CRMC, although we are hired by the developer, by Deepwater. That's specific to Rhode Island, but nearly every single offshore wind farm in the US, or in the globe, actually has a third party of some kind. In other places, it might be called project certification or IVB, independent verification body. In some places, it's dictated by national law. In some places, it's not. Where it's not, it's usually used by the developer to give some confidence to the insurers and to the banks, because it's in everybody's best interest to double check these things, fix any issues or discrepancies up front instead of dealing with them when the things are out in the water where it's much more expensive to make any more repairs. So talking about the load simulation, this is kind of a mysterious part of the design process that not a lot of people really understand. Chris mentioned about 5,000 load cases. What a load case is a description of a combination of environmental factors and also operating conditions of the wind turbine. So we're looking at the statistics over a year for the wind direction and wave direction, which is the example which is used here, but we're also looking at distribution of wind speeds. We're looking at turbulence. We're looking at wind shear, because the wind is actually higher at the blade tip than it is at the bottom of the rotor sweep, and combinations of winds and waves, which is very important for the fatigue life. Each of those 5,000 simulations is run in a real-time simulation program, and each simulation is between 10 minutes and 1 hour. So you're talking about 3,000 to 5,000 hours of simulation time. We're also looking at the extreme cases or the maximum cases, as Chris mentioned, hurricanes. Deepwater also looked at nor'easters as a separate condition because they have different driving forces than hurricanes, which are also significant, and you can't lump them together. Other maximum conditions can come from external events like grid losses, and also from an error in the control system of the wind turbine, or a shutdown because of external conditions. Then when we talk about the computer model that's used to do the load simulation, there's actually several teams and several software programs that are involved in this. No. There we go. So this is a software package called Bladed. That's very typically used for wind turbine simulation, and this was employed by the wind turbine provider, GE, and it was also used by ABS to do our independent simulation. And then on the other side, you have a representation of the model in SACS. SACS is very typically used for offshore structure design. And that was used by the substructure designer Keystone, and again by ABS to do our independent verification. The designers did a lot of work up front to make sure that these software models were done correctly. How that was done was by comparing the models and putting the same inputs into each model, making sure that the two different design teams were getting the same answer out of those models. And again, this was considered one of the most critical aspects of the design. So we actually agreed with Deepwater that ABS would do a complete independent load simulation. So we had our own models, we had our own design team doing separate simulations. And then at the end of that process, we compared, and this is a very small example, but we actually did this for every one of those 5,000 load cases, looked at the differences between the CVA results and the wind turbine designer results and the foundation designer results, and made sure that they were matching very closely.
Thanks, Rain. I will go through fabrication and installation, turbine installation, and what that design means for those phases of the project. And perhaps after these phases, if you want to say on your ABS role on these three phases, I think that would work fine. And then John can take over on the O&M aspect of the wind farm. So after the design, we start with the fabrication. And the substructure, the jacket, is one of the most important elements there. I would say also a difficult element. everybody is focused on the turbine. And of course, that's pretty, modern technology. But if you see for offshore construction, a jacket is always an element that can go wrong, and you have to pay a lot of attention that it is fabricated in the right way and installed in the correct way. So, taking the fatigue aspect of it, it means a lot for the fabrication of this foundation. You translate that in material specifications. So this steel is not normal steel. I don't think even you can buy this steel in the United States. It has real values, they call it Sharpie values, that in cold weather you can still bend the steel for 100,000 times and it won't break. It's not brittle steel. So your material specification is the key. And then you start welding it. And welding is pretty bad for steel. You have a lot of heat input, and if you don't do that in the right way, then your fatigue life of that weld will be 1 year instead of 25 years. So what you do a specific welding procedure, and you do exactly the weld you want to make, and you take a sample of that, you test it in your lab whether the weld properties is suitable for 25 years of lifetime. And then if that weld procedure is approved, then your welders, after special training, are making exactly that weld. So also your weld inspector, looking that that weld is in accordance with the welding procedure, your QC documentation that you can verify that your weld is in accordance with that, and afterward your weld inspection, sometimes that's X-ray, but normally it's ultrasonic testing, that you can see there are no inclusions, no cracks. All that is important for every weld in this structure. And probably there are 10,000 welds in a structure times 5. So there's a lot of paperwork inspection. And in that respect, ABS is on the yard as well, is reviewing the documentation and is underwriting that all the quality control and the welding is in accordance with the design specification. That's a very important aspect. Also a picture that we used American suppliers for the foundation for the fabrication of this foundation. Gulf Island did a great job on fabricating these foundations in Louisiana. For the next project, we are talking to them that will happen here in Rhode Island. Montco is a jack-up supplier. Keystone was already mentioned as the designer, and ABS, of course, as the CVA. During installation, you almost have the same story. The installation sequence is pictured on the top. So you see the jacket that's lifted from the barge. It's put in the water and put on the seabed. It has mud mats that it can temporarily sit on the seabed, but that is pretty temporary. Then you have to put the piles in, as on the middle picture, and drive the piles into the seabed. I assume there has been quite some stories on noise and pile driving, so that is all taken into account during this installation. And when the piles are driven to grade, you do a cutoff of the piles because the elevation of your topside is very important. You only have a tolerance of 0.2 of a degree. Otherwise, your turbine is, with 1 degree, a 100-meter turbine, it's not a very nice view. So you never know how that jacket sits on the seabed. So you can do a cutoff of the pile, which is completely horizontal to ensure that your topside is horizontal. And then you do an offshore weld between that topside and the pile. And you also do some grouting, but the grouting is not the main connection between the turbine and the foundation. So what I explained for the welding on the fabrication side is exactly the same during installation. Perhaps even more difficult because you are in an offshore environment, you have wind, you need protection and everything. But you also have pile driving fatigue. So your whole analysis on 5,000–6,000 blows into your pile, that's eating up half of the fatigue life of your foundation. And you have to ensure that 25 years is left after that foundation has already consumed that installation fatigue. So again, a lot of inspection, a lot of well testing, a lot of QC documentation and review also by the third party. The cable installation, 2 pieces of cable. We had the main cable going to the mainland, built by National Grid and called Sea to Shore. And we have our export cable from Block Island to the wind farm and a few inter-array cables. Here is the cable lay barge. What's the pointer? Something like this. No, that doesn't work. I'll show it over here. Good voice. So, we have a storage tank in the middle where you see the full cable, and at the stern we have a ramp where the cable runs into the sea, and then we have the jet plow with all the environmental analysis and benthic and sediments, and so great to have Aileen there and work with the team. So there's a good combination of the ability to install the cable and in a way that it does not affect the environment and the habitat and everything. Then we have to pull in the cables into the foundation. We installed so-called J-tubes on the foundation. So that are these tubeless. That one works as well. The cream, thank you. So there is a steel cable running all the way to the seabed, connected to the cable, and then you pull in the power cable to the top of the transition piece where it is terminated. And then at the same time we are preparing for the wind turbines. So here you see a picture of the factory in Saint-Nazaire, France, where Alstom manufactured the nacelles. At the bottom you see the full nacelle. And you see this piece, which is more or less the generator. And here you see the rotor where the blades are connected. So what they do is a full test of the generator to prove that it can run, that the temperature is under control, cooling is well, that energy production is there. And it's also a spin run that you can see that the generator is making all those rotations. So again there, it's important to have your assembly procedures, that you know that the turbine is assembled in the right way. The same for material specifications. Also, for instance, here in this hub, this one is rotating 12 RPMs for 20 years. So the fatigue life in that part is also enormous. So the specifications and the testing of that piece is also critical for the success of your project. Then you have the factory inspection, QC documentation, and also with that we had close cooperation with the CVA. Rain has been there. There were local ABS representatives to go through all this manufacturing to ensure that the turbine is suitable for 20 years and manufactured in accordance with the design. And then finally they arrive at the wind farm, and then we have to do the installation. A lot of people, think that this is something, and you know, it's pretty spectacular. But I would claim this is an easier part than the foundation installation. Foundation, you work in a seabed. It's always hard to see what you encounter in the seabed. You work with moving vessels. Turbines have to be installed with jack-up vessels. So they don't exist in the United States. So we hired a Fred Olsen vessel who is doing these installations in Europe every day. And they sailed over to the United States to do this installation. First they install the towers, then the nacelle on top of that, and then finally the 3 blades. So here you see a picture of a full installation. John will go into why we have all these vessels. But during installation, you have the same aspect as for the foundation. You have your installation procedure, which is very important. It's reviewed by the CVA, also by a marine warranty surveyor, and by us, that we know that if you lift it in that way, and all lifting aids and rigging is all in line with the specification. So then they start doing this. We have our inspectors, ABSs on the vessel, and in the end it again comes down to the QC documentation during installation and the CVA review and inspection. So at the end, during installation, we have a full record of the full wind farm, that it is built in accordance with the regulations. I think the next one we will move to John, but perhaps Rain, do you want to add something on the whole fabrication installation?
Well, yeah, one thing I would add for the manufacturing is that it's really a global effort. So the foundations were obviously fabricated in Louisiana. The wind turbines were assembled in France, but there were also those load path components, as you mentioned, the fatigue is very important, that were manufactured in, I think, 8 different countries when I counted it. So all of these suppliers, each one contributes to the structural integrity of the whole wind turbine and substructure installation, and also contributes to the ability of the wind farm to meet its 20-year lifetime. So it's really important for the developer, but also for the CVA to think about, you know, there's all of these different suppliers, and there's a great diversity in experience of those suppliers. How do we design our inspection plan? The Deepwater QC inspection plan, but then also the CVA witnessing plan. How do we direct our efforts so that we have the greatest impact on quality and focus on you know, a critical component over a not so critical component, or focus on a supplier that might be doing this for the first time versus a supplier that's done it hundreds or thousands of times. So that was definitely something that we talked about a lot during the planning, is where to put those efforts, how to best spend our resources.
Yeah, and you know, it sounds easy, but you know, I can tell you that sometimes we said to ABS, well, tomorrow we start doing this, and then they had to find out a way to get an inspector there. So we had quite some discussions on doing this in the right way. I think in the end we had a nice program. But there was quite some flexibility on both sides to get all this in place. Moving to vessels, and the captain knows everything about vessels.
If I can operate the remote here, that'll be a plus. How's everybody doing? Been a long couple days, but this is exciting to get to this point. As Chris talked about, there's quite a bit that went into just to get to this pretty momentous occasion. This is a shot of the first sailing, the first components leaving Provport and headed out to the wind farm to be installed. So this was taken by drone footage from the port, so it was a pretty big celebration day. So you see here in the photo, these are 2 jackup barges. These are Montco vessels, one carrying a rack of 3 blades in the top tower section, and the one that's further downriver carrying the 2 tower sections, the bottom sections and the middle section. So there's enough here on both vessels to install a whole turbine at a time. So this photo is actually a great example of like Chris said, it's quite a bit of work that goes into getting to this point. Once we do get to this point, it's almost like putting up, if you remember being a kid, putting an erector set together. It really goes kind of that fast. We think it was a total of about 18 days, if I remember correctly, from start to finish, and that included weather, which is pretty remarkable. So here, as you see, they're installing with the vessel from Europe. The last blade had just gone in. And here in the foreground, you see that the other feeder vessel is already waiting at the next foundation for the installation vessel to move over and start installation. So we stayed consistently ahead of the game with this feeder barge concept, where we send the barges out, load them up in Proudport, send them down the river, and have them standing by and waiting to be installed. And we just kept going like that around the clock, 24/7 through those 18 days. There was a little bit of weather involved, but really not much. As you get higher up, it becomes a much more difficult construction process. Obviously, these blades are designed to catch wind, and that's exactly what they want to do as soon as you lift them out of the cradle. So it takes quite a bit of doing and some serious technology, big hydraulic grippers to hold the blade and install it. So it's quite the thing to see. Here's one of my favorite shots of the whole project. That's a human being right there in the center of the nacelle, waiting for the blade to come in. There's about 120 bolts altogether there that he's getting ready to ratchet on. It's a pretty incredible shot, really. And as I said, this is the point where as you go higher and higher, wind speeds become more effect on the construction. So turbine installation was complete summer of last year. This is like what we call the whiskey plank shot. If any mariners in the room, whiskey plank is when you finish, the last plank on the ship. This is our whiskey plank moment. In the background, you can see the Atlantic Pioneer. That's our crew transfer vessel. That's how we get all of the technicians back and forth out to the foundations and the turbines. They're actually dropping off technicians in the shot, and they're getting ready to start the commissioning process. So as we were installing, folks were already going in behind and commissioning the turbines. So some key factors and lessons learned. Number one is planning and preparation is a massive part of it, the whole thing. People much smarter than myself, engineer team. As a captain, I rely on engineers all the time in shipping. If something doesn't work, I just pick up the phone and ask why. I hit buttons. But the engineers are the ones that really put everything together. So the amount of planning and preparation that went into the engineering and all the folks associated with the permitting and planning was key and essential to get this done in 18 days. The independent third-party verification obviously was in the construction process and continues now that we're in 1 year old, but has continued this past year in operations and maintenance. Stakeholder engagement and communication was critical. So during construction process, we went and reached out to as many people up and down Narragansett Bay and the surrounding area that would be affected by the movement of these components. I think at the height of construction, we had about 16 vessels moving back and forth to the site, so that's a considerable amount of traffic to coordinate. So we reached out and, that first shot that you saw of the components going out, there was quite the flotilla in the parade. We had fire boats and police boats, and everybody wanted to be a part of it. And then by day 10, no one called me and no one wanted to be part of the parade anymore, which is fine. That means everything went well. So, and having the right team, good working relationships, that's obviously goes hand in hand. Here is international cooperation as well. Again, at the height of construction, we probably had, I think, 15 different countries, flags hanging in the Proudport office. So a lot of different languages, a lot of folks with very different jobs, from CVA to engineers to folks like myself, all having to coordinate and communicate to make sure that this went off without a hitch. And the weather, I think there's a reason there's 2 explanation points there. Weather is, you know, as we go forward and in operations and maintenance right now at Block Island, weather is key. So weather access, that's the number one thing. So if you have an issue out at the wind farm, you need to send a team out on the Atlantic Pioneer. And that team then climbs up onto the turbine and fixes whatever issue, just as you would onshore. But you have that added layer of technical difficulty where those folks need to be fully qualified to go offshore, fully qualified to work offshore, to work at height. And you add the weather in there, sometimes it's not as flat, calm, and beautiful as it is right here in this shot. Sometimes you've got some wave height to deal with. So it changes the operation as you go onshore to offshore quite a bit. So that labor force that goes into working offshore has to be trained up and has to be qualified to do such a thing. ABS as well. ABS is fully qualified to work offshore. I think Kwang Min is in the room, who worked with, here he is. Kwang Min worked quite a bit with Rain on the project. A lot of long hours watching these guys, making sure everything was going the right way. So shout out to Kwang Min. And then the operation and maintenance phase, which it's our birthday today. I'm really glad to have a 1-year-old child. It's my only child. So what goes into operations and maintenance? Preventive maintenance plan is a very big thing. We spend a lot of time on spreadsheets and plans and making sure that we're checking everything that needs to be checked and following the equipment manufacturer's guidelines. It's about 1 week per turbine per year that's planned. And then unplanned as required. So just as you would onshore for any kind of power plant, if something goes wrong, that's the unplanned maintenance. You have to put together a team and respond and send them out and fix the issue. Balance of plant inspections, that's pretty much everything you see there in yellow when we talk about balance of plant. That means GE, who's supplied the turbines, is responsible for maintaining the turbines themselves, but we have quite a bit of equipment that's not under the GE scope. That means the foundations, the submarine cables, the control room at Block Island. So that's part of the O&M balance of plant. And then if there's a storm, a major storm, we have to go out and do an inspection, make sure everything looks okay. And then the quality control documentation and inspection reviews, that's where Rain and I will continue to work hand in hand going forward for the life of the project to make sure that everything is ticked and tied and that we're doing everything that we're supposed to be doing. And that also goes to the CRMC. This here is just a quick slide on how we've done this year through winter weather. We're very happy to report that we have had no issues due to winter weather and that the turbines have operated as expected. We had quite a few big weather events this past year, and we're very happy with how they performed and chucked on through some really, really strong winds. Collaboration. So, what we've been talking about for the past 2 days is quite a bit of research and work that's gone in, some in the social science, some in the physical science. This here is an example of a bat and avian monitoring equipment that goes on the turbines. We have quite a few examples of equipment that we put out on the turbines and the foundations themselves. And, I've worked in and around science for 15 years, and I love to facilitate science, but I also have to educate the scientists on what it takes to get to this point. So this looks cool, but it really takes quite a bit of logistics and planning and training to get out to this point and put some equipment on the foundation. So, it's not just as easy as, hey, I have this great idea of what I want to do to monitor, this situation. Well, that's great, but we have to get there, and it's a process. So this is the fun shot, the glory shot, if you will, though. And then just another overview of what we're servicing. So 5 turbines services approximately 17,000 homes. 300 plus construction jobs were associated. And of course, we're first in the nation. The smallest but most famous. And I believe that's it.
CRMC has asked us to continue the independent verification throughout the operations phase. So that'll be for the past year and the next 19. We are doing that mainly through documentation review. So every year we will review the current O&M procedures, work procedures, as well as the QC plan and the EHS plan that Deepwater and that GE have to execute that work. And then once the maintenance is done, we will review the records of that and make sure that the maintenance was done according to the plan, and also that it was recorded in a way that's traceable and that somebody can go back later and find out what was really done. Each 5 years, we'll also do an on-site witnessing program. So we'll go out with the GE technicians and with the Deepwater technicians and witness everything they do. That's a way to double check that what they're recording is really what they're actually doing in the field, which of course they are. And the other exception is if there's any damage or any event, like Chris mentioned, a major storm event, Deepwater and GE will go out and do an event-based maintenance. And the first thing that we would do for that is, again, review the plan and review the record. If we see any issue or if it's a certain severe event, then we might decide to go out and do witnessing or do additional inspections as well. And all of that reporting, again, is going directly to CRMC.
Okay. So we have a few minutes for questions, I guess, hopefully. I don't know. I sort of was keeping track of major topics and categories and came up with sort of 7 major categories of activity and processes and, thousands of details in each one. So, I think that gives a sense for the complexity of the project. I have some questions in case, but I think we should probably go to the audience first. So, Brian.
Sure. I just had a quick question on, can you remind me how the towers and blades got to the Port of Providence, and also Jones Act, and how Jones Act may or may not be an issue moving forward?
Yeah, I would say Jones Act is not so much an issue. It's just a law, so you have to work in accordance with the law, and that's possible. Jones Act is that you cannot transport goods from a U.S. harbor to another U.S. harbor, and a wind farm is considered as a U.S. harbor. So that's why we use the Montco vessels. That's a Jones Act compliant, U.S. flagged, U.S. owned, U.S. built, U.S. operated vessel. So transportation took place with those Montco vessels, and installation took place with the European vessel while not moving. Interesting detail is that we put the nacelles on the deck of the Fred Olsen vessel, because in accordance with the Jones Act, it is allowed to transport from a foreign harbor to an American harbor. So you can put them in France on the vessel, sail to the wind farm, and install those nacelles. So we worked fully in accordance with the Jones Act. We had a ruling, we checked that, so it was verified that that is the case. So I expect for the coming wind farms, that will be the model to be used. And then when we have more wind farms and there is more utilization, then by that time there will be an American jackup vessel. But my guess is that that is 7-8 years from now.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you. I was wondering how often the inspection doesn't agree with the deepwater wind inspections. Is there a lot of concurrence or not a lot of concurrence? And what happens when they don't agree?
Yeah, well, so maybe to clarify, we're not doing our own measurements. We're witnessing what Deepwater is doing or what their contractors are doing. So what we're looking for is, we've done a complete review, so we come in right after the COP has been approved, and we start with the FDR, which is the Facility Design Report, which is a collection of hundreds of documents prepared by Deepwater and all their subcontractors. And then the FIR, which is the Fabrication and Installation Report, which is those detailed plans of how they're going to execute the work, how they're going to do the lifts, how they're going to do the welding, how they're going to do the bolting, how they're doing every detail, as well as their EHS plan and their QC plan, and that of every contractor and every sub-supplier that's going to be executing any work on the site. So we have approved that before we go on site. We've approved their plans that, yes, this is consistent with good practice, it's consistent with industry standards, it's consistent with the regulations. So when we're on site, what we're really looking for is, are the inspections that Deepwater is doing, or is the work that Deepwater is doing consistent with what's in their own documentation? So we're not taking really independent measurements and then comparing the measurements to what Deepwater is doing. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, and how often did you find out to sync with their own plans?
Well, it varied a lot with sub-suppliers. So there were definitely some that performed very exemplary and some that left something to be desired. So we had to go and work that out. But yeah, I mean, in the end, everything was addressed and everything was brought up to expectations. So there weren't discrepancies left at the end.
I would say it's a process, to give an indication. I would say you start with, when you review 100 documents or 100 line items, 10%, 15%, you come back with questions on, can you clarify this, can you clarify that? And then you go through the process, and those questions are closed out. So it takes 2 or 3 rounds to close out everything, and we're all on the same page. So that's the process. But normally it's very strange. If the first time we give documents, it's 100% okay, and that's pretty normal.
All right, I think that's the allotted amount of time, so let's give a hearty thanks and congratulations.
Well done. Sir, enjoyed it.
Okay, we got one more session. No slides. We've got a few changes to the panelists. Mary Boatman is playing Jim Bennett as the leading lady, and Dave Butel is playing Grover Fugate. Then we have Aileen and Bruce Carlisle. Bruce Carlisle is playing himself, supporting role. So this is going to be short and sweet. You guys all situated? Yes, someone left their glasses on the table. No, they've been there for, yeah. It's kind of an inside joke in the front of the room. Whose glasses are those? Okay, so I have noticed I've been very impressed with the way all 4 of you have really been paying attention to what's going on, asking good questions. Bruce, you arrived a little late today, but we won't point that out. Yeah. So Bruce, I'll make you go first then. No, I'm kidding. No, you don't have to go first. But what I wanted to, again, this was all of your idea to do this, okay? It's their fault we're all here, okay? In the middle of Thanksgiving and Christmas. And I think these have been two amazing days. What I'd like to hear from you all is, what are, maybe each one of you could share a couple of the highlights that you had over today, maybe a point you'd like to emphasize, or sort of like, oh, I hadn't thought about it in this way. Dave Butel, ladies first. Why don't you go first, Dave? Keep everybody awake.
I guess from my perspective, looking at the 2 days and talking about so many different pieces of the science and fisheries and birds, and I was going to say bats and birds, but we really didn't talk about bats today. But and the social impacts, community impacts, and what struck me is that having been closely involved in this all along, there was a whole lot of things I didn't know. And what that emphasizes is the need to do something like this on a more frequent basis, so that we all have the full perspective. And while you certainly can't get the full perspective in 2 days, you can capture part of that and then be able to delve into the pieces that you don't know fully yet.
Great, thank you. Aileen, would you like to go next?
Sure. So, so I was heavily involved in scoping out the conference, and my goal was that folks would understand just how much work is going on, not just at Block Island by Deepwater Wind, but by others, BOEM, others, and the other work that Massachusetts has done, and just have it all in one place, because what Dave just said is a perfect example. He's worked on this project very closely with us for 7 years now, and he doesn't even know everything that's going on. So I think that it is important to have this kind of a diverse science forum. It was funny when John O'Keefe was showing his slide there, where he was kind of saying the logistics of deploying things offshore, I thought to myself, well, we forgot to tell everybody about the scour monitor, because we're also monitoring scour. So even as we're wrapping up here, I'm thinking about even more things that we're doing there that we didn't highlight here. So, I think it's important to do. And, if nothing else, it gives you, if you're an agency person or if you're a stakeholder, it broadens your knowledge about how much work is going on, but it also gives you a point of contact on who to reach out to learn more about a study, or now you know when to expect that the results will be coming out. That was really what I was hoping that folks would get out of it, would be just kind of that ability to network within the science that is ongoing in the region.
Great. Mary, do you have any? What were your highlights?
I had quite a few highlights, but I think the biggest one goes back to what we were just talking about, is how do we communicate all of this and the different ways to communicate, because there is so much. And what you saw here in the past 2 days was really just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot, because when we were planning, I gave you the laundry list, and you're like, well, we can only do a few things. There's so much more that's out there. And how do we communicate that most effectively, and open to suggestions from anybody about how better to communicate, and also to communicate to different audiences, because not every audience wants the detailed scientific information that some of us are happy to sit through, but most of us aren't. And so how to communicate that better. So that was one of the biggest, how to make the data available, how to get this all out there, and then how to put it together and link the questions that everybody's asking with the answers that we already have and the answers we still need to get. So those are my main take-homes.
Thanks. Bruce?
I guess I would sort of echo what these guys have said, but it's really impressive. I mean, you just look at the agenda alone, just at the sort of scope and breadth of the work. that's been done not only for the Block Island wind farm, but for sort of offshore wind in general, and actually, leading up to that, the work that was done and sort of ocean planning and ocean management, and continues to be done. So seeing that all, getting a sort of a good, I guess, snapshot even, because it was sort of like speed dating a little bit. But as Eileen said, there's some good follow-up there in the right context. One of the big takeaways from me was that it's great to see the Block Island Wind Farm as a sort of project-specific, where they are now with the studies, the control before, after control impact, and even the associated studies, which aren't quite sort of that same rigor, but very, very, very important. And really sort of confirming we are seeing no moderate or major adverse impacts, and understanding that there's still studies going on and still work to be done. And that's across the board, from the spectrum of marine animals to marine habitat to sort of the socio-political, cultural part of that. So I think that was a big one. I guess the other sort of highlight for me was this concept that people have raised about the need for continuing to coordinate, collaborate, have forums for discussion, and I would definitely agree. I kind of like Dave's idea about an annual event. It gives you some job security, which I know is very important to you. No, but seriously, something where, and I guess the addendum to that is, I think we need to be a little careful about creating sort of new organizations or, vehicles. And my advice is to try to maximize the use of existing forums, because we're all busy. And I think one of the themes we've heard today is, while there is a need for early and often coordination and engagement, there's a burnout factor, and there's just a sheer bandwidth factor. So trying to figure out that sweet spot is going to be important.
Great, thank you. So I'm looking around at the audience, those of you who are still here. So we still have researchers, we still have Block Island residents, we still have commercial fishermen here, recreational fishermen. This is your last chance. Advice? What advice do you want to give to these people, or encouragement in nice words? Use your manners. Gentleman in the back, and then Chris.
Block Islander. I'm not in the scientific community at all. I'm a finance person. I was impressed by all of the disciplines that are brought together here. And it seems to me that there's an opportunity for the scientific community to reach out to the rest of us. Tell us what you're doing. Not in the detail it did here, but the fact that there's so many of you working on the offshore wind industry, it's just mind-boggling to me. And I think that should be told to the common person.
So, in a nutshell, it is amazing how many people and how many organizations are focused on this topic, and that what you're suggesting is that needs to be communicated more effectively to the broader audience. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Great. To the non-scientific community. Again, good job security for us, if you're interested. Chris.
Yes, thank you. I guess I'm not going to provide specific advice, but what I am going to do is take a minute or two and issue our profound thanks to Deepwater Wind and CRMC for the job that you have done as it relates to our part of the ocean. That we viewed ourselves as possibly the most affected. And we are comfortable to say that, you have provided us with one of the greatest gifts that we could receive, is that you have raised the bar on all of the other developers from this point forward. You have set a standard that we will be able to look back and reference and point out and critique. So that is of enormous value to us. Another thing, site maintenance. When the site was selected and the magnitude and scale of construction fearful that there would be no shortage of pig iron laying around the bottom of the ocean when it all got done. That is not the case. You guys were incredibly respectful of the site, and that translates to happy trawlermen towing their nets around. And also, you know, we've gotten to know you over the course of time, and we know you to be good, honest people. It is very easy for good, honest people to accumulate their skills in a massive project under the watchful eye of a huge company and have the effect not be that of something greater than the sum of their parts. That did not happen. Deepwater Wind did their job taking their parts and amplifying their value. So from the fishermen who negotiated this with you, we look forward to butting heads with you on the next one. And we will. But we do so from a position of people who have been down this road before and have been rewarded with your honesty and you with our trust. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's really nice, Aileen. Really, you should be proud of that. Good neighbor, good partner, trusted entity with CRMC. Really impressive. So nice job.
Well, there's a lot of other people here in the room who also participated and helped make it successful. So it's been good. And, you know, we can only, as we move forward, it's more complex. The projects are bigger. They're further offshore. There's cables back to shore. There's states that are not used to working collaboratively together. There's different commercial interests. So we keep going with the same spirit, and we hope that have the same outcome.
Yes. Yeah. What about Chris? Great. Thanks.
So I think my takeaways, one of them was similar to Bruce's in that I've heard sort of like little rumblings about all of these projects going on, and that nobody was really seeing any major adverse impacts. And I think it was really great to see the researchers actually discuss that and see it all the way through. I guess my cautionary side that I take away from this meeting is just recognizing that what you see in 5 turbines might not be what you see in 100 or 50 or whatever the scale is. So I think that's something we're all just going to need to be mindful of, is that as the size of the project increases, like Aileen just said, it may be that some of the effects change as well. So I think we could lull ourselves into a sense of complacency by having the really well done and I think overwhelmingly positive results from the 5 turbine project, and hopefully that will turn out to be the case with a larger project. But some things like I heard people talk about changes in current patterns. That's not something you're going to see with 5 turbines, but you might see with 100, right? And so I think as we explore these larger projects, we need to continue to maintain the scientific sort of vigor that we have up to now. And I think as much as I heard a few people say like there are some things that we can check off the list, I think we should be cautious about how we check things off the list, just thinking about the difference in scale. So I mean, again, like really great results to date. Hopefully we'll see larger projects developed with also really almost no impact, but I don't think that's a given.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Dave.
I think I said related some of these things before, and I'd like to echo what everyone else says. It was a great, wonderful job. I was amazed at and I try to stay up on as much as I can what's going on. I was amazed at the amount of science. And I agree with Bruce. The major takeaway is that there's no major impact here. And I think that there does have to be some kind of, I know you have a portal, some kind of entity that processes the science, and then as the gentleman in the back mentioned, then interprets it for the layperson, because I think that is extremely important to do. It boils it down to, look, there's no great impact or major impact on habitat, marine mammals, et cetera, and here's all the backup. So I think two things, and not just as deepwater wind develops other wind farms, but as the industry grows, this is something you're going to have, unfortunately, you're going to be taking on some of the baggage of your competitors, other leaseholders, because the industry will be tainted by what anyone does, or will be bolstered by what anyone does. So that's why I almost think there has to be this center where the science is processed, and then it's interpreted and is pushed back out to the public in general, not scientists once again. So.
Great. Go ahead.
I haven't heard anyone mention in this last session the special area management plan. I don't think any of this would have happened without the incredible work that was done on the special area management plan. We would be so much further behind. And so like kudos and accolades to all of the people involved in that, in creating the bedrock upon which the wind farm could be built.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Any last minute comments from our esteemed panel? Again, you all made this day happen. So your thoughts, your information, your contacts, you guys have a boatload of contacts. I know that for sure now. Thank you very much for doing that. Any other last minute comments from you guys? No?
Well,
Dave?
Jen, I'll put forward that you organized this.
Yes.
You
I
made this
did?
happen. So,
Thank you.
You and everybody else.
Thank you. Thank you, and it does take a village. Kathy Dwyer over there has also been doing a great deal of work, and all of our team at CRC has also been helping out, so it's been amazing. So with that, I think I'm going to end. Thank you all, and hope to see you next year. Take care.